In the long and dramatic history of warfare, nations have always searched for weapons powerful enough to change the course of a war. And during the early years of World War II, Adolf Hitler ordered the creation of one of the most extreme weapons ever imagined, a colossal railway artillery gun known as the Schwerer Gustav, designed and built by the German industrial giant Krupp in the 1930s to destroy the seemingly indestructible Maginot Line, a vast network of underground bunkers, reinforced concrete walls, artillery turrets, steel armor, ammunition depots, and tunnels built by France along its eastern border, some protected by more than 7 meters of reinforced concrete that ordinary artillery could never penetrate. Hitler demanded a weapon capable of smashing these defenses from many kilometers away, and Krupp engineers responded with a truly monstrous design, the Schwerer Gustav, the largest artillery weapon ever constructed, weighing about 1,350 tons, stretching 47 meters, 155 feet in total length, with a gigantic barrel over 32 meters long and a caliber of 80 centimeters, 31 inches, large enough to fire the biggest shells ever used in combat, each weighing nearly 7 tons, including massive high-explosive shells and concrete piercing shells designed to burrow deep into bunkers before detonating. These enormous projectiles could travel nearly 47 kilometers, 29 miles, before crashing into their targets with devastating power, capable of destroying underground fortifications and ammunition depots, though each shot placed incredible pressure on the barrel, slowly wearing it down and requiring eventual replacement, which showed just how extreme the engineering challenge truly was. Operating such a weapon required far more than a normal artillery crew, because the Schwerer Gustav needed thousands of personnel, including about 250 engineers and technicians, to assemble the gun itself, a process that took around 3.5 days, while roughly 2,500 additional soldiers and workers had to build specially designed double railway tracks strong enough to support its enormous weight, along with security units and multiple anti-aircraft batteries stationed nearby to defend the giant weapon from enemy aircraft, since it was so massive it could easily be spotted from the air. Ironically, by the time the Schwerer Gustav was finally completed, Germany had already defeated France in 1940 by bypassing the Maginot Line through Belgium and the Ardennes, meaning his supergun never fired a single shot at the defenses it had been designed to destroy, and instead it was transported to the Eastern Front, where it would finally see combat during the siege of Sevastopol in 1942 in the Soviet Union, one of the most heavily fortified cities on the Black Sea, protected by deep underground bunkers, coastal artillery, and hidden ammunition depots buried beneath rock and concrete. German commanders believed the Schwerer Gustav could help break these defenses, and after nearly 4,000 men worked to transport and assemble the gigantic weapon near the battlefield, the gun began firing its enormous shells at Soviet positions, eventually launching around 300 rounds, including one legendary shot that reportedly destroyed a massive Soviet ammunition depot buried almost 30 meters underground, demonstrating the terrifying destructive power of the weapon. And after months of intense fighting, Sevastopol finally fell to German forces. Afterward, the giant gun was moved north toward the Soviet city of Leningrad, where German commanders initially planned to use it during the siege of the city, but those plans were later canceled before it could be deployed again. Around the same time, another mysterious name began appearing in German records, Dora, which some historians believe was simply another name used by German crews for the Schwerer Gustav, while others argue that a second, nearly identical gun may have been constructed, though wartime records remain unclear, and historians still debate how many of these giant weapons were actually built. Even more ambitious ideas were proposed in 1942, when German engineers suggested mounting the massive Gustav cannon on a gigantic armored vehicle known as the Landkreuzer P-1500 Monster, essentially a super tank capable of carrying the enormous artillery gun without railway tracks. But the idea proved completely impractical, and was eventually canceled as Germany's situation in the war grew worse. By 1945, the war was coming to an end as Allied armies advanced into Germany from the west and Soviet forces pushed from the east. And to prevent such advanced technology from being captured, German troops reportedly destroyed the Schwerer Gustav on April 14, 1945, leaving only wreckage that was later examined by Soviet engineers. Although the Schwerer Gustav—
Yet the story of the Schwerer Gustav did not end with its final shots over Sevastopol. By the time the enormous gun had demonstrated its destructive power, the nature of the war was already changing rapidly. Air power was becoming the dominant force on the battlefield, and massive stationary weapons like Gustav were increasingly vulnerable. Allied bombers could strike railways, supply lines, and assembly areas long before such a weapon could even be deployed. What had once been envisioned as the ultimate siege weapon now seemed like a relic of an earlier era of warfare. Still, the legend of the giant gun continued to grow among both German soldiers and their enemies. Stories circulated about the massive shells screaming through the sky like incoming meteors, shaking the ground miles away from the impact site. Soviet defenders in Sevastopol reportedly felt the shockwaves from Gustav's explosions deep inside their bunkers, where even thick layers of concrete and rock could not always protect them from the devastating blasts. The psychological effect of such a weapon was almost as powerful as the physical destruction it caused. But building and operating such a colossal machine placed enormous strain on Germany's already stretched war economy. Each shell fired by the Schwerer Gustav required huge amounts of steel, explosives, and manufacturing resources, all of which could have been used to produce tanks, aircraft, or conventional artillery pieces that were far more practical on the rapidly changing fronts of the war. Even transporting the giant weapon was a logistical nightmare, requiring specially prepared rail lines, security units, supply trains, and constant maintenance crews. Meanwhile, the Allies were developing weapons that represented the opposite philosophy of warfare: smaller, faster, and more flexible. Strategic bombers could deliver massive amounts of explosives across entire regions, while mobile artillery units could quickly reposition on the battlefield. Compared to these modern systems, the Schwerer Gustav increasingly looked like an oversized experiment rather than a practical tool of war. By the later stages of the conflict, Germany simply no longer had the resources to continue projects of such enormous scale. Factories were being bombed daily, fuel was running short, and the German military was forced to focus on defensive weapons rather than giant experimental machines. The age of super heavy siege artillery was coming to an end. And yet, decades later, the Schwerer Gustav still captures the imagination of historians, engineers, and military enthusiasts around the world. It remains the largest artillery weapon ever built and fired in combat, a staggering example of human engineering pushed to its absolute limits. The gun's massive barrel, towering railway mount, and 7-ton shells represent a level of ambition rarely seen in military technology. In many ways, Gustav symbolizes one of the central lessons of modern warfare: that sheer size and power do not always guarantee victory. Wars are often decided not by the biggest weapons, but by mobility, strategy, logistics, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions on the battlefield. Today, only fragments and photographs remain of the colossal gun that once shook the ground of Sevastopol. But the legend of the Schwerer Gustav lives on as one of the most extraordinary and controversial machines ever created in the history of war. And if you think this weapon was unbelievable, wait until you hear about the even more insane superweapons that engineers tried to build during the war, machines so massive and ambitious that some historians still struggle to believe they were ever seriously proposed.
But if the Schwerer Gustav was already one of the most unbelievable weapons ever created, some of the ideas that followed were even more extreme. During the later years of World War II, German engineers began imagining weapons that pushed the limits of technology, logistics, and even common sense. One of the most astonishing proposals was a project known as the Land Cruiser P-1500 Monster, a gigantic armored vehicle that would have carried the same massive 800mm cannon used by the Schwerer Gustav. Instead of mounting the gun on railway tracks, engineers imagined placing it on a colossal tracked vehicle, essentially turning the world's largest artillery cannon into a moving fortress. If it had ever been built, the Land Cruiser P-1500 would have weighed nearly 1,500 tons, making it heavier than many naval warships. The vehicle would have required multiple submarine-style diesel engines just to move, and it would consume enormous amounts of fuel every hour. The design was so large that it would have needed a crew of more than 100 soldiers simply to operate it. In addition to the gigantic main gun, the vehicle was expected to carry heavy anti-aircraft weapons to defend itself from enemy aircraft. But even with these defenses, the vehicle would have been an obvious target. From the air, it would have been impossible to hide. And that was the greatest problem with many of these giant weapon projects. By the early 1940s, the battlefield had changed. Aircraft dominated the skies, and any weapon that was slow, massive, and easy to spot was incredibly vulnerable. German military planners eventually realized that the land cruiser P-1500 monster would have been nearly impossible to deploy in real combat. It would have required special roads or reinforced ground just to move, massive supply convoys to keep it fueled and armed, and constant protection from air attack. In reality, such a machine might have survived only minutes once enemy bombers discovered its location. Because of these enormous challenges, the project was eventually canceled before construction ever began. Another related concept, the land cruiser P-1000 Ratty, was slightly smaller, but still unbelievably large. This vehicle was designed to weigh around 1,000 tons and carry a naval battleship gun as its main weapon. The idea was to create a land vehicle with the firepower of a warship, capable of destroying enemy fortifications from incredible distances. But once again, the idea faced the same fatal flaws: extreme cost, impossible logistics, and total vulnerability to air power. Even Adolf Hitler, who was fascinated by enormous weapons and engineering marvels, eventually approved the cancellation of many of these projects when the reality of the war began turning against Germany. By 1943 and 1944, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts and desperately needed practical weapons that could be produced quickly and in large numbers. Instead of building giant experimental machines, factories shifted toward producing tanks, aircraft, and rockets that could actually influence the battlefield. Ironically, the most successful German superweapons turned out not to be gigantic artillery guns or super tanks, but advanced technologies like the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Unlike the enormous Gustav cannon, the V-2 could strike targets hundreds of kilometers away and was incredibly difficult to intercept. Yet even these technological breakthroughs came too late to change the outcome of the war. By the time the conflict ended in 1945, many of Germany's most ambitious weapons projects existed only on paper or as incomplete prototypes. The era of giant siege weapons like the Schwerer Gustav had passed, replaced by faster, smarter, and more flexible forms of warfare. Still, the legacy of these massive machines remains fascinating even today. The Schwerer Gustav stands as the largest artillery weapon ever built, a reminder of how far engineers were willing to go in pursuit of overwhelming power. By the final
it also
months
tells a
of
deeper
World War II, the dream of gigantic superweapons was collapsing along with the regime that had created them. Germany was being pushed back on every front. Cities were under constant bombardment, factories were running out of materials, and the once ambitious vision of building the most powerful weapons in history was quickly turning into a desperate struggle simply to survive. Somewhere in the chaos of the collapsing German front lines, the massive remains of the Schwerer Gustav sat silent on its railway mount. The weapon that had once symbolized technological dominance had become a liability. If captured, it would reveal valuable engineering knowledge to advancing Allied forces. So in April 1945, as enemy troops closed in, German forces reportedly destroyed the enormous gun themselves. Explosive charges tore through the massive structure, twisting steel beams and collapsing the giant barrel. What had once been the most powerful artillery weapon ever constructed was reduced to shattered metal scattered across the railway tracks. When Soviet engineers eventually arrived and examined the wreckage, they found the remains of an engineering project unlike anything they had ever seen. Even in pieces, the scale of the machine was staggering. The barrel alone was longer than many buildings, and the railway carriage system that supported it stretched across multiple rail platforms. But by that point, the war was nearly over. Within weeks, Adolf Hitler would be dead in his bunker in Berlin, and Nazi Germany would surrender to the Allied forces. The massive gun that had once been designed to break the strongest fortifications in Europe had ultimately played only a small role in the enormous conflict that defined the 20th century. In the decades that followed, historians and engineers continued to study the story of the Schwerer Gustav. On one hand, it was an extraordinary achievement of engineering. Designing and constructing a weapon of such scale required incredible technical skill, advanced metallurgy, and logistical planning that pushed industrial capabilities to their limits. But on the other hand, it also revealed a powerful lesson about warfare. The massive gun required thousands of personnel,
days of assembly, specialized rail lines, and enormous logistical support, just to fire a handful of shots. In a world where aircraft could strike from the sky and mobile armies could maneuver rapidly across continents, such a gigantic weapon simply could not keep up with the speed of modern war. The future of warfare would belong not to the biggest machines, but to the most adaptable technologies. Today, the Schwerer Gustav exists mostly in photographs, historical documents, and the memories of the soldiers who witnessed its thunderous blasts. Yet its legend continues to fascinate military historians and enthusiasts around the world, because it represents a moment when human ambition pushed engineering to an almost unimaginable extreme. A weapon so large it required railways to move, shells so heavy they could destroy underground bunkers, a machine so massive that even today, nearly a century later, nothing like it has ever been built again. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Schwerer Gustav. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in history is also the most impractical. But its story remains a powerful reminder of how far nations will go in the pursuit of overwhelming power, and how the line between technological brilliance and strategic excess can be dangerously thin. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most incredible machines ever built during World War II, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and support Steel and Sacrifice for more dramatic stories from military history. Because history is filled with weapons, battles, and moments that sound almost impossible, yet they really happened.